So this is topic 1, titled Macroeconomic Fundamentals 1. Topic 2 is Macroeconomic Fundamentals 2. So there's a lot that we need to get through in terms of our basic understanding of the macroeconomy and financial markets before we can really appreciate what's going on in the world at the moment. So let's move through to the second slide. And these are the topics covered in topic 1. So there's 5 of them, and I'll produce 5 separate videos. In this video, we will run through the difference between nominal and real values in macroeconomics. Now, this is an important distinction, and where we're going to get to in this video is that nominal values are meaningless in economics. Real values have meaning. And we're going to run through 3 different types, or we're going to consider 3 very important economic variables and look at the difference between the nominal values of those variables and the real values, which will motivate an understanding of the difference between nominal and real values and why real values are far more important and more meaningful than nominal values. So we're going to look at GDP, and then we're going to look at wages and then interest rates. And we're going to start off by looking at what a nominal value is for those variables and what the real value is for those variables as well. So let's start with GDP. GDP is gross domestic product, and gross domestic product measures the total value of all final goods and services produced in an economy, say over 1 year. So the Australian Bureau of Statistics in Canberra produces estimates on a quarterly basis and on an annual basis of GDP for Australia. So I guess it's interesting to think, well, what is the value of GDP likely to be for Australia? So think of all of the goods and services, final goods and services that are produced and sold in Australia over the space of 1 year. What do you think the total value is going to be of all of those goods and services? It's actually pretty close to $2 trillion these days. So very large amount of money. Now, obviously, countries like the United States have values of GDP closer to 30 trillion, but there's many more people in the US. So on a per capita basis, 2 trillion, that's reasonably high. So GDP, total value of all final goods and services produced. The word final is important because we don't, in this measure of GDP, we don't include intermediate goods. So we don't include the value of the timber which goes into the production of a timber table, because GDP will include, the measure of GDP will include the full value of the table when it is sold in the marketplace. So that table might sell for $1,000, that timber table, and that will add $1,000 worth of GDP to our total GDP in Australia. Now, if the value of that timber was $200, that is an intermediate good. You don't want to include the sale of the $200 worth of raw timber and the sale of or the value of the $1,000 table as well, because the $200 worth of timber is already included, in a sense, in the final sale price of the table of $1,000. So by including intermediate goods and final goods, you'd actually be double counting to a large extent. You would be double counting the market value of the intermediate goods. So GDP is important because it's directly linked to the employment of labour. So the higher the level of GDP, the more workers that firms will want to employ. So think of GDP as the amount that is produced. As GDP is growing strongly, for example, firms are going to be crying out for workers, and there's going to be very strong growth in the demand for labour, very strong growth in the number of jobs in the country, and the unemployment rate is likely to fall. Same with capital. And of course, as we'll see later on in the course, GDP is very strongly linked to the inflation rate. So the idea being, if we are producing a lot of GDP, and well, let me put it another way, if the growth rate in GDP is growing quite strongly, then it is likely that we're going to have inflation problems. Now, the reason for that will become clear later, but all I need you to understand now is what GDP is, and that it is linked to some very important variables in the macroeconomy, two of them being the unemployment rate of labour, also the unemployment rate of capital, that's quite important as well, and the inflation rate. And of course, by capital, I don't just mean machinery, although that is one example of capital. I'm also talking about things such as roads and railways, infrastructure, port facilities, office space that is rented out, all of that is capital equipment. So basically, capital equipment is anything that workers use to produce output. So office space right through to machinery and tools and railways, roads, airports, all of those examples are examples of capital equipment. So we need to monitor the growth rate in GDP. But then the question is, well, what measure of GDP do we use? Because there's two measures. There's nominal GDP and there's real GDP. So in this table, I've got an example which shows the difference between nominal and real GDP. So I've got 4 years on the vertical axis, and I'm assuming that in the year 2020, the average price level was $1 and the quantity was 100 units of output. Now let's just keep this simple and imagine that we're talking about food. And this is the total production in Australia for 2020. And all we produced was food, and we produced 100 units of food. And the average price level of that food was $1 per unit. In this case, nominal GDP would be 100. The next year, the price level increased a little bit. It actually increased by 5%. And the level of output, that increased by 50% up to 150. So nominal GDP is simply P times Q. The price of food times the number of units of food produced. So we produced $157 worth of food in 2021. And 2022, 2023, similar sort of idea. We've got the price level continues to rise. And that's very accurate because each year, generally, prices will be higher than the previous year. Now, that's not true for all individual items, but I'm not talking about individual items here. I'm talking about the average price level across all final goods and services in the Australian economy. So in this case, I'm talking about the price level of all types of food, because I am assuming that the only thing that is produced in Australia at the moment, or in this example, is food. And at the same time, we do get increases in output. What allows increases in output each year? More capital, more labour, better technology. And in the case of this example, probably a little bit more land that is being used to produce food. So what we've got is nominal GDP rising. Now, very often what we want to do in economics is work out the growth rate in nominal GDP. It's an important indicator because if nominal GDP is growing quickly, we know if GDP is growing quickly, not nominal, if GDP is growing quickly, we know the economy is performing quite well. That will mean a lot of jobs are being created, et cetera, et cetera. If there's more output, if the growth rate in output is strong, there's going to be more employment, more income, more output for everyone. So it's an important indicator. But the problem here with nominal GDP and using this measure is that it's biased by the inflation that is built into this price column here. So the reason that nominal GDP is increasing each year is not simply because output is higher, it's because we are allowing inflation to be incorporated into the nominal GDP figure. What we would really like is for the price level to be kept constant in calculating our measure of GDP and just allow the quantity to increase. Because if GDP is increasing simply because the price level is increasing, then just imagine another example where I had quantity at 100, 100, 100, and 100. I would still have nominal GDP increasing, but not because Q is going up, simply because the price level is higher. And the level of employment of labour and the level of employment of capital is linked to the physical quantity being produced, not what it is being sold at in the marketplace. And so what I want to do in calculating a true measure of GDP is actually remove the effects of inflation so that I can focus on a measure of GDP which reflects the quantity of output being produced. And that's exactly what I've got over here. Over here, I'm calculating real GDP. And to calculate real GDP, this is pretty much the way the Australian Bureau of Statistics does it, although they've got obviously a more sophisticated way of doing it, but it's basically the same principle. I'm keeping the price level fixed at the 2020 level. So over time, I'm acknowledging, yes, the price of food is rising, but when I'm calculating my real GDP measure, I'm not allowing those prices to be built in to the GDP estimates. I'm not allowing the inflation over here to bias my real GDP estimates. So this is nominal GDP, this is real. And so in calculating real GDP, the only thing I'm allowing to vary over time across the years is the true level of output, the quantity. And so you can see the level of real GDP grows much more slowly than the growth rate in the level of nominal GDP. And that should be perfectly obvious. Why? Because we're holding the price level constant. Now, I could have calculated real GDP a number of ways. I could have, instead of $1 in this price column, I could have used the price level in 2023 and just made that $1.20. I would have ended up with different real GDP figures, but the growth rate in GDP, in real GDP, would have been the same. So looking at the growth rate in real GDP from this year to this year, I can work out that the growth rate was 50%. That tells me a lot. It tells me that the true level of, well, it tells me that the quantity of goods and services produced between those 2 years increased by 50%. Whereas the growth rate in nominal GDP over the same period is 57%. But that is not, that's a distorted number, because what is creating some of this 57% increase in nominal GDP between these 2 years is simply inflation, simply prices rising. There's no point in allowing prices to be, price rises or inflation to be incorporated into your GDP measure. So in that sense, real GDP is the most important measure of GDP. Nominal GDP doesn't tell me very much at all. Looking at nominal GDP over this 4-year period, nominal GDP has increased by 3 times, from 100 to 300. But that's a meaningless number, because it could be that most, if I had changed these numbers, I could have got a 3 times increase in nominal GDP simply by increasing the price level by 3 times, with output being constant over those that 4-year period. Okay, so real GDP takes out the effect of inflation or price level changes over time and gives us a more accurate measure of real GDP gives us a more accurate measure of how the quantity of goods and services produced over time is changing. So hopefully that makes sense to you. The next example is real versus nominal wages. So I've got this equation here. Now, let's start with the nominal wage, because when most people talk about wages, what they have in mind, what they actually mean is the nominal wage. So let's just assume that you graduate a couple of years from now, and maybe not your first salary, but eventually you end up with a salary of $150,000 a year. And let's assume that all you can buy is food, and now a unit of food is $5. So I've got a price level there of $5. The real wage is simply calculated as the nominal wage divided by the price level. So the real wage, I've actually got too many zeros there, haven't I? But that doesn't matter. So that should be 30,000. I've just noticed that. So 150,000 divided by 5 is 30,000 units. So the real wage is actually the number of units of output your money wage can buy you. And if you're living in an economy where you're getting paid $150,000 a year and the price of food is $5 and all you buy is food, you can buy 30,000 units. Now, in economics, we consider the real wage, not the nominal. And let me motivate this with the following example. Let's just imagine that you lived in New Zealand. And let's also assume that some magical reason or some magical way, New Zealand also used the Australian dollar as its national currency. So they didn't use the New Zealand dollar, they used the Australian dollar. And you were living in New Zealand and you said to me, Paul, I'm getting paid in Auckland, I'm getting paid $150,000 a year. Isn't that great? I wouldn't be able to respond to you. I wouldn't know if that is a good salary or a bad salary. It all depends upon what the price level in Auckland is. So for example, if the price level of, let's say, food in Auckland was $1, you'd have a great life. Whereas if the price level of food in Auckland was $50, things would be tough for you. However, if you told me that you're living in Auckland and your real wage was 30,000 units of food, which is pretty much the same as what it is in Australia, then I could actually gauge that that real wage is actually quite good. So this is the equation which shows you the difference between the real wage and the nominal wage. Now, the only reason that a person's nominal wage or their money wage, that is their wage expressed in dollars, the only reason that that means something to you as an Australian or someone studying in Australia is because you have a fairly good idea of what the average price of goods and services is in this country, and you have a fairly good idea of what $150,000 a year will buy you. And so you'd look at $150,000 a year and think that's a pretty good salary, but you wouldn't just be thinking about the number itself, you'd be thinking about what it can buy you. So subconsciously, you would be comparing that $150,000 to the price levels of the goods and services you typically buy and inferring how much or how many goods and services you could buy with that money. So subconsciously, you would be comparing $150,000 to the price level of the goods and services you typically buy and making a judgment on whether that nominal wage is high or low on that basis. So what you're really looking at when you compare your money wage, your nominal wage, to the average price level, you're actually thinking about your real wage. It's just that you probably haven't realized it up until now. Now, an alternative interpretation of the nominal, of the real wage is this, or an alternative interpretation of this equation goes something like this. If nominal wages are rising by 2%, but the inflation rate is 5%, then the real wage is falling by approximately 3%. That means you're getting paid 2% more in terms of dollars each year, but prices are going up by 5%. So the purchasing power of your wage is actually going backwards. Your purchasing power is actually declining by 3%. And so this is just what I've highlighted here, is really just considering this equation, but in terms of growth rates of the different of these three different variables. So once again, if you tell me your money wage and I don't know anything about the price level, it's a meaningless number to me. However, if I know the money wage that you're getting paid and the price level, then I can infer what your real wage is. Now, in this example, we have calculated the real wage as 30,000 units of food. But what we'll see in the course is that the real wage is typically measured in dollars and cents as well. It's not measured in units of food, it's measured in dollars and cents. So that's a minor complication, but we'll get to that. Probably the most common usage of this equation is down here in these two lines here. When we say things such as if nominal wages are rising by 2%, if your money wage is rising by 2%, but the inflation rate is higher, then you're going backwards. That's the most common use of this equation. So once again, real wage tells me a lot, nominal wage tells me very little. And finally, real interest rates. So what we've got here is another equation to help us understand the difference between nominal interest rates and real interest rates. So the nominal interest rate equals the real interest rate plus the inflation rate. I've got an example here. What we're assuming is that you're putting money into the bank in a term deposit for 12 months. Let's assume it is $1,000. You're putting $1,000 into a 12-month term deposit, and the bank is paying you 6%. Now, if you said to me, I've just put $1,000 into the bank and my return is 6%, that's the interest rate they're paying me, and you use the words return, I would think to myself, no, it's not. It's not the return at all. Because you would be talking about the nominal interest rate that you're getting paid, and that's not the return. The real interest rate is the return. So to explain that, let's assume that over that 12-month period, the inflation rate was 4%. So January 1st, you put $1,000 into the bank, and at 6%, at the end of the year, you'll get $1,060 back, 6% more. But let's assume that over the course of that year, the inflation rate was 4%. That means that while you have 6% more money at the end of the year, the prices of the goods and services that you buy, on average, are 4% higher. So how much has your purchasing power gone up by? Well, you have 6% more money, but prices are 4% higher, so your purchasing power has increased by roughly 2%. Okay, so that's a very important distinction, and one that will come up again and again in this course, the difference between nominal and real interest rates. So I have looked at the difference between nominal and real interest rates from the perspective of a lender. That is, you lending your money to the bank. So when you put your money into a term deposit, you're actually lending your money to the bank for a period of 12 months. What they'll probably do with that $1,000 is lend it out to another customer. They'll charge them maybe 8% on that loan, pay you 6%, and they'll make a nice profit margin of 2%. That's how the banking system works. It's a little bit more complicated than that, obviously, but that's kind of the basic idea. So yeah, I have gone through that example from the perspective of a lender of money. That is, you loaning your money to the bank in a sense. You could look at the difference between nominal and real interest rates from the perspective of a borrower. That's a little bit more challenging, and I'll leave it to you to sort of look into that if you want to. So what we've gone through there is the difference between nominal and real GDP. Figured out that real GDP is the only measure of the GDP variable that makes any sense. We've gone through the difference between nominal and real wages and worked out that real wages are the only measure of wages that make any sense. And we've looked at the difference between real interest rates and nominal interest rates, and once again, worked out that real interest rates are the only measure of interest rates that make any sense at all. So just reinforcing the difference between nominal and real values, and the fact that real values are the ones of most interest and most meaning to economists. Now, those examples, real GDP, real wages, real interest rates, we will be referring to all of those throughout the course. There'll be various articles that we'll read from the Australian Financial Review, various articles in other places. In our case studies, these ideas will come up again and again. So it's worthwhile just absorbing what the difference is between these nominal and real values. Perhaps the fourth most common variable in economics where the distinction between nominal and real values is important is the difference between nominal and real exchange rates. That one is a little bit more difficult to explain though. It's a little bit more complex. So we may well save that for later in the course. But I think these three examples should be nice and straightforward. So I encourage you, if any of that is not clear, do the reading that is related to the difference between nominal and real variables. There's plenty to read on this. If there's any problems with these concepts, then the tutorials are exactly the right place to ask questions. So I'll leave it there, and just keep in mind these the nominal measures of these variables tell you very little. And it's worthwhile challenging yourself, just going back and trying to explain why nominal GDP tells us very little, why nominal wages tell us very little, and why nominal interest rates tell us very little. They're not informative versions of, they're not informative measures of these different variables. And if you can explain why nominal interest rates are meaningless and why nominal wages are meaningless, then you've probably actually understood this, this concept quite well.